Hello and welcome. Welcome to this EUTOPIA Learning Community podcast. My name is Modest Vengust from the University of Ljubljana, and together with colleagues across the EUTOPIA Alliance, we are exploring how ethical perspectives in animals, food, and the veterinary profession intersect. This podcast is part of the EUTOPIA Learning Community Veganism versus Animal Protein Consumption. Our aim is to create an open, thoughtful space to discuss ethical challenges in veterinary medicine and society. In this first episode, Veganism, Veterinary Medicine and Communication, we look at how different ethical frameworks shape the way veterinarians and society understand animal use, responsibility, and care. Joining me are two remarkable thinkers, Dr. Federica Timetto from Ca' Foscari University of Venice and Professor Christian Munthe from the University of Gothenburg. Together, we'll reflect on how dialogue can help bridge these perspectives and support the next generation of veterinarians in navigating ethical complexity. You will find short biographies of both guests in episode description below. To begin, I'd like to ask both of you a broad opening question. How do you each understand the central ethical question around animals and food? And perhaps, Federica, you could start us off, and then, Christian, I'd like to hear your view on how philosophy frames this issue.
Thank you, Modest. I must say that from my point of view as a feminist anti-speciesist, I say that veganism is the main praxis of my approach. And as you know, anti-speciesist feminism substantiate the political struggle in an ethical dimension that is one of respect and care for all lives, including non-human life. But it also doesn't conceive of an ethic that is not at the same time also a political practice. Being food for the other is not the main point, is not the only point, because as you know, predation exists and must be recognized and analyzed in context. But this is true, this is a truth, but it cannot be universalized, nor can we ignore that this concept is not properly applicable to farmed animals, right? Because there's a system behind it. And at the same time, I would say that veganism cannot be universalized either. For example, a renowned feminist theorist, Val Plumwood, says that what is called ontological veganism is a problem because it imagines a truth of veganism that is valid for anyone. So that the chain of life nurtures on other lives is true. But when we talk about farmed animals, we are talking about institutionalized oppression. And we are talking about the animal industrial complex, the way animals are treated like machines of production and reproduction. And this system, from my point of view, entails violence and nurtures violence in turn, because it creates and reinforces violent relationships that are between human and non-human animals, but also among humans themselves. Think, for example, about the rate of injuries and psychological disorders and damages that are related to the animal industrial complex, also for the workers. So for feminism, veganism is a main praxis because feminists, anti-speciesist feminists, not all feminists, of course, see meat consumption as interconnected with not only material facts and problems, but also with a symbolic plane. Feminism relates speciesism, which means the idea that you are superior only because you belong to the Homo sapiens species, as a problem that interconnects with other discrimination, social discrimination and discriminatory ideologies. For example, sexism, for example, racism. And feminists also insist that veganism is not, and on the contrary, meat consumption is not a matter of individual choice, because individual choices do not occur in a vacuum, but are shaped by the society in which the individual lives. So we should probably ask ourselves why eating meat is considered normal and natural in the society in which we live. And why are farmed animals rather than, for example, companion animals? And also this differentiation, which is of course social, are immediately categorized as edible and thus killable, as if edibility or killability were a property that belongs to them naturally. There are many approaches that can be adopted, and a mixed social psychological approach, such as, for example, Melanie Joy's one, explains that eating meat is considered natural, is considered normal, is considered necessary, the three ends, she calls them, but also it is considered nice because it involves desires and pleasures. But these must be reconducted to the society that we live in. And so we should be aware of the fact that meat eating is never a natural fact, but is always a relationship. And any relationship is contextual. So what my perspective insists on is the fact that we need to name relationships between the flesh and the dead animal, between us and the animals, between us and the other humans that we live with, between our diet, so-called diet and ethics, and the context we live in, and between also violence and carnivorism and violence against non-human animals and, for example, the economic system that sustains all this, which of course is capitalism. This is also reinforced by language, and that's the reason why we talk about also the symbolic plane. And the language of rights is also very problematic in this respect, because it remains anthropocentric and very often justifies the right to enforce some violence on non-human animals. So when we talk about meat, we need to be aware of the fact that we are talking about relationships on the one hand, but also about an absence, the absence of the subjectivity to which this meat belongs, right? And an absence that is produced, that is not natural, and is produced along a chain, a disassembly chain, we could call it. That is one of objectification, alienation, fragmentation, and consumption. And this involves all bodies, not only non-human bodies. That's why we insist on the interconnection with other discrimination and forms of oppression, such as sexism or racism or ableism, for example.
Thank you, Federica. Christian, how does philosophy approach this question? Is it about harm, rights, or something else at its core?
So in philosophy, this is an old discussion, and also a discussion where you, as in all philosophy really, you take a step back and you can notice things, that several of the things here that Fredrika mentioned, for example, that there's a lot of unsystematic ideas and hypocrisy and sort of what seems to be totally arbitrary divisions between how we treat different kinds of beings and things like that. in our cultures and in our societies, and they are interconnected with institutions and the way we organize ourselves politically and economically. So not only, I would say, under capitalism, in real socialism that we had historically, you had this just as much, really. So that's not really the difference there. So for the philosopher, that's kind of your starting point and not your end point. And then you start, okay, so in what way is this sort of implausible or irrational? And what would be sort of the rational or plausible way to look at these things? And then philosophers start to describe different kind of ideas in this matter. I think a very early philosopher in the Western tradition is, of course, Jeremy Bentham, who formulated, and it was a scandal at the time in the early 1800s, where he formulated the idea that it doesn't matter what kind of being you are, it doesn't matter sort of how your cognitive abilities are developed or anything like that. What matters is that you is sentient, that you can suffer and feel pleasure and pain, and you can have kind of this subjectivity that Fredrika mentioned. So this is a very common idea in philosophers that have picked up on this, is to try to work out more precisely what this subjectivity is, and then use that in sort of more deeper analysis when you have people who defend different kinds of practices, like the animal farming practices, for instance, that we have. And look at them and say, well, your defense actually ignores this thing, which is important, right? And another thing that philosophers do is that you also point out that some attempts then to defend these practices lead you also to having to defend practices which most people are not prepared to defend. So this is a very famous argument, the demarcation argument from Peter Singer, who is also famous in the sort of ethics around animals. That his simple point is that wherever you try to draw the line to sort of exclude animals from moral consideration, some human beings will follow. So if you say that animals should not be part of our basic moral consideration because they are not intellectually developed enough, for instance, you will immediately have to say that some humans are not intellectually developed enough, so they will also be outside of what we should consider. And that is usually used then as an argument against these defenses of the practices, right? So this is often what philosophers do, though. Then they pose different kind of theoretical standards against each other and try to match them to sort of very commonly held moral ideas. So, for example, the moral idea that also a stupid human being is morally important, for instance, or someone with low intellectual proficiencies is also morally important. This is an idea that very many people share, but then it becomes difficult to explain why you shouldn't also have a lot of consideration for most of the higher animals, higher as the biology talks about them as higher, right? Because they also have intellects and cognitions and so on a very similar level. So that's one example of how the philosophy goes about. Then you have the more, so Fredrika mentioned Val Plumwood here, which is an interesting example, because then you extend these ideas. Another famous person in this is, of course, Tom Reagan, who sort of developed Kantian ethics to also include animals, and that is a whole discussion of itself that has continued now with other philosophers have sort of done various other ways. And why is that important? Yes, Kantian ethics is, in the Western tradition, at least in the European tradition, a very, very strong sort of theoretical foundations for a lot of sort of policy standpoints and ideological opinions and so on, all across the board. So that's therefore Kantian. So Bentham, as I mentioned, he's more like, he belongs to another camp. He belongs to consequentialism, which is another ethical tradition, which is also strong. But these two are sort of the strongest. And on top of that, you can add another strong moral philosophical tradition, which is, of course, then the tradition of virtue ethics from Aristotle, which is maybe the oldest of all of these, where the focus is not so much this, what should we do, how should we organize society, but rather, how should I be as a human being? How should I sort of foster my own perception of the world and of other people, and in this case then other beings, and how should I, what kind of attitudes and feelings should I try to foster in myself? So that's the sort of main idea in virtue ethics. And well, Plumwood is one example, I would say, of someone who sort of stretched that, because that way of doing moral philosophy, focusing on that bit, has been very strong in what we call environmental ethics, where animals become, you expand even further than just the sentient animals, right? So you also include like natural systems or habitats or biotopes or even whole ecosystems or even the entire planet sometimes. There are very radical theories in that tradition. But of course, all of these theories are between themselves not in agreement. They try to do sort of lay foundations in different places and explain what you find to be a discrepancy or kind of some fault with the main culture of the time, right? So the role of the philosopher is maybe to start with cultural criticism, but then just try to build something else instead. That's the sort of role of the philosopher. And then different philosophers build different things, basically, based on the same perception that there is something wrong with the way that we perceive ourselves in relation to other beings. And then you can end up drawing your borderlines in different cases, because when you then go back and try to do practical politics or practical ethics and apply this in practice, then of course you have to make trade-offs, and you have to deal with the fact that not everybody agrees with you, as Fredrika mentioned, and with the fact that in order to have a discussion with other people, you have to some extent at least sort of adopt their viewpoint in order to understand them, even if you don't agree. So you can have this sort of fruitful discussion going forward. And I think what philosophers then can sort of contribute in that arena is this sort of family of different ways of describing ideas more clearly. So you can say, when someone argues in a certain way, you can say, okay, I recognize this way of thinking. This is an understandable position that I know that some people have sort of developed in certain ways. So I can relate it to other ideas, rather than just being upset and angry and sort of think that this is an enemy I have to combat, right? So there's someone I can talk to, and we can have a discussion, and we can look for how we communicate with each other. So that's how the philosopher thinks about the thing. So philosophers are very used to being deeply in disagreement and very friendly to each other.
Thank you, Christian. So many veterinarians...
I would add just a little
Okay, yes, please.
to what Christian said, just to identify, I hate the word identify, but differentiate, okay, the feminist standpoint on this, because I think that, and I also wrote a book about the history of the relationship between the animal rights fight and the feminist tradition. I think that what feminism in general, in this case, adds to this framework of different positions, discussing, arguing, and relating to each other, is the fact that we also need to take into account the lived experiences of the bodies. which are bodies in relations, always. That's why, according to me, for example, the discourses, the foundational theories of like Peter Singer or Tom Regan or even Gary Fanchon, for example, that belong to different tradition, utilitarianism or the deontological tradition, as Christian said, all them try to universalize what they're talking about. And this is something I really don't think it's very useful when we talk about, especially veganism as a praxis, because as Christian himself said, practices need to relate to lived realities. And so it's very, very difficult to do discourses that are valid for anyone. You can indicate paths, you can give trajectories, you can also try to enlighten the complexity of all this. But then...
Yeah, I totally agree. So I could add something then that's going on in the sort of applied ethics based on all of these things is that one thing that which I think connects a lot to feminist thinking is that you plug these basics ideas into less of an ethical standpoint but more of a political one. So that's when you can start to talk about oppression, for instance, and exploitation and these kinds, and injustice and these kinds of things. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is precisely what you say, Fredrika. So I'm thinking, so we have a lot of students and others that come and have different kinds of practices of this sort, right, that they endorse. But they endorse them for very different reasons individually. So some of them have some kind of deeper theoretical position that they have come to after maybe lots of reflection and other things. For other people, it could be very intuitive. So it's just that you feel some kind of feeling of resistance to these practices, and that's enough to put you in that camp. And for some, that may also lead to theoretical reflection, but not everybody needs the theoretical reflection. Some of them are very happy doing this. And then there's also, I could add in the moral philosophy, there's also, of course, the kind of instrumental sort of motivations, like you mentioned that, Fredrika, that you also think about that this way of relating ourselves to other sentient beings and other living beings can harm them, but it can also harm ourselves. So, and that's an old idea in moral philosophy. That's so Kant is famous, for instance, for articulating that kind of argument. It's just that what the philosophy does is that you see that that's a different kind of way of motivating the practice than when you base it on some deeper idea that non-human animals are as morally important from a basic point of view as we are, for instance. So there are different layers. So you have everything from individual ethics to real politics, and you also have lots of different ways of going into the position that you have in your practice. And I would say that you can add to this also some aspects of just psychology, right? So social psychology, so you're fostered into certain social practices and these become your habits. And usually human beings are sort of unwilling of abandoning habits or things that they were taught when they grew up, right? So that can also explain where people, so if you've grown up in a context where you recognize these other ideas about animals, then it becomes very different. When you come from another context, you have to do a little bit of an individual revolution to change your sort of outlook on things. So there's also the facts of sort of the limits of human nature and sort of social psychology that we are sometimes sort of standing in the way of ourselves, so to speak. By our own lights.
So really in relation to what was already said, many veterinarians feel caught in the middle of this complex situation, right? That's between caring for animals and the realities of animal protein production or client expectation, right? Christian how can ethics help us navigate this tension without collapsing into a guilt or defensiveness or similar?
So one of the things is the thing I thought about tomorrow, that if you know more about how you could think, then it's easier to understand when other people think in a different way than yourself. So that's kind of one thing. So for a veterinarian, it becomes important to sort of to understand that the sort of negative reaction maybe to what's going on the farm, where the veterinarian comes to do his or her job, right? It's not just, it's not baseless anger. It's based on something. It's coming from a motivation. And there's something you could talk about there, maybe in a calmer situation sometimes. But there is a way of talking about it by having knowledge and so on. Then for the veterinarian it becomes a bit complex, because on the other end you will have the farmer and the system around you in that sort of constrains how you can act, right? So I know, for example, in Europe that a lot of veterinarians earn their income from sort of serving a system, for instance, a system which is organized in a way that you have to give farm animals a lot of antibiotics because they are becoming unhealthy all the time because of the way you organize the whole meat production, for instance, and then from a veterinarian standpoint, you would maybe rather have a situation where the animals are more healthy, so you don't need to give them all that antibiotics, right? And it would also be good because of antibiotic resistance and all of these kinds of things. It's also harming human beings, right? So maybe in that case, then you're caught because you're getting paid for prescribing these drugs, not for not prescribing these drugs. And this is the way that society has set up the system. You can't really control that situation if you're going to be a veterinarian. And I think that, so there are two ways there. Understanding sort of the basis a little bit of the viewpoints where people are sort of critical and negative towards maybe your work or the context where you do your work, but also understand how the system around you constrains your actions and your possible ideas here. Because so the idea of not prescribing antibiotics becomes impossible, right? Because then you leave the animals very sick and they will suffer and they will be unhealthy before they are slaughtered. And then, but if you had another organization, then that wouldn't be necessary. On the other hand, then you have to recognize that from some standpoint, that's not enough, right? So from a lot of standpoints, having sort of a healthier and a nicer kind of farming for the animals, from some standpoints, that will not be enough at all. So, and that's an interesting tension, I think, to have that. On the one hand, you can have like a pragmatic discussion of doing a bad thing as little bad as possible, or you can have the more radical standpoint where you just say it should all stop, right? Or something like that. And if you say this should all stop, then you have another discussion that you have to think about as a veterinarian, which becomes different because I'm comparing a little bit the veterinarian sort of position here as a professional to a human medical or a medical human doctor, right? So the medical doctor will be in a very similar position towards, you have a certain aim towards your patients. The difference in the human doctor case is that you have no farmer. And you have no farming food production system around you. You have just you have people who are oppressed in the workplace and things like that, but then they fall ill and they come to healthcare to get help, right? So that's the position, and that makes it easier for a medical doctor that treats human beings than for the veterinarian, because the veterinarian here sort of the harms that you try to attend to that belong to the animals are not, so the animals are not your patient. You have the animals as your patients, right? But you also have this client, which is the owner of the animal, the farmer or the owner of the pet or whatever it is, or the owner of the woods where people hunt or something like that. And that's a thing that makes it very different from an institutional contextual position to have a strong professional ethics as a veterinarian, that you're constrained by that situation. And that leads, I think, back to Fredrika's point that there's a political sort of liksom domain of the ethics in this area, which is much more sort of visible and immediate compared to when you discuss medical ethics in human healthcare practices.
And Federica, yeah, from your cultural and feminist perspective, right? How do you see the emotional challenges faced by veterinarians and our students in this context?
Well, let me say that I definitely agree with what Christian lastly said about the fact that the existence of a client in between, right, the veterinarian and the patient complicates things a lot. This field is very complicated because, once again, when you talk about ethics, you have to talk about politics. And when you talk about politics, you always end up talking about ethics if you have to especially defend a radical and not a welfarist position, which Christian explained very, very well before. I, of course, stand with the radical position, as you know, but I know that this is not something that can happen all at once. This is not something that can be, once again, universalized. This cannot be applicable for anyone. And so, I mean, it's not easy. I was saying that I position myself in the radical approach. So an approach of total liberation and not an approach of improvement of a system that I consider unjust. I don't want to improve a racist state, right? Just giving different rules and laws in order to respect a little bit more those that are discriminated or those that are exploited. I just want this system to be dismantled. Of course, the tension between a welfarist position and a radical position is fruitful because the one cannot exist without the other, as Christian said. That said, for veterinarians that feel caught in the middle, as you said, Modest, I think that it's not easy to navigate contradictions, but we can be equipped to confront them and to reply to them. And another thing that I would like to add to this is that information and data and so knowledge is the basis for discussing, of course, but it's not enough, because there's always the risk of falling into the argumentative trap. I don't know if there's a better term in English, but the one in which you have to prove something, to demonstrate something in order to convince the other in a dialogue. You don't have to demonstrate anything when you defend your veganist choice or you justify yourself for what you do. You just have to learn respectfully how to navigate differences and contradictions. So I believe, and my suggestion to the students is, don't be afraid to speak up, but at the same time, don't be also afraid to listen to other positions. There's no need to arrive to a definite conclusion. I think that is definitely more useful to build a path towards a change, right? And societies change, thus professions change, and also opinions change about things that are considered facts or natural, as I said before, just like eating meat. In this respect, I would like to address the audience to a very interesting debate, a little one, but a very interesting one that took place in the Veterinary Record Journal in 2022. And that was initiated by a vet nurse, Leanne Dalton, that in a very short editorial or letter, I don't remember now, said, and I quote, "We are expected to treat all our patients equally, but equality should extend to animals beyond those in our care. Is it not contradictory to perform life-saving surgery on one animal and then eat a chicken sandwich straight after?" Of course. Yes, of course. For me, it is contradictory, just like it's contradictory to distinguish between slaughter and euthanasia, for example. Why are some animals only given hit in their head, slaughtering them even in humane ways, and others, for example, those that are closer to us, that are familiar and not farmed, for example, companion animals, are euthanized. They die, but one dies in one way, the other dies in another way. And why is this difference acceptable? Why are animal categorization acceptable? Why is the language that we use continuously reinforcing, for example, cognitive dissonance? And that's why I very much insist on how we use language and how we could also change the words that we use. And this first piece of Daston, in which also she said, our profession is encouraged to practice reflective learning. Reflective learning is very, very much important. And so we have to consider whether our actions are true reflection of what we believe, right? Do we feel at peace with ourselves? Do we feel honest with what we do? This is a very basic question, I think, even beyond the veterinary profession. But this piece of Daston initiated a debate in which, that's why I address the audience to the debate itself, in which we can observe how very different position. The one from the British Veterinary Association, for example, the one of the farm vet, the one of the companion animals vet, confront each other, right? And also resort to a series of tropes and stereotypes that those studying the field know very well. On the other hand, for example, the idea of finding Dalton, very offensive for her extremist position and her attempt to enforce her moral superiority, which, from my point of view, if I read what she wrote, is not true at all. So this is a very defensive position and a very rigid one. But on the other hand, there are other positions also from the veterinary area that say we should try to educate rather than alienate. And this is, for example, Emily Craven. She's a farm vet. She disagrees with Dalton, but at the same time, she says differences must be respected and clear answers are impossible because we are not static, because there's a evolution, temporary evolution of ideas, evolution of social habits, and this doesn't happen all at once. So be patient, be capable of listening, but at the same time also defend your ideas. Try to avoid being trapped in the argumentation trap, in which you have to demonstrate what you also feel. And I want to conclude this again with the suggestion not to rely only on reason, but also on empathy, but also on feelings, but also on embodied sensations and relations that tell you very much beyond language and beyond demonstration.
Thank you, Federica. So we now already established that communication across different views is often where tensions become visible, right? So Federica, I have a further question to really build on what you already said. What does ethical communication look like when value systems, for instance, between a vegan and a veterinarian, differ so deeply, like you just mentioned?
Let's start from the idea that social actors differ a lot for the social variables that concur to their position in society. So a vet can be also very different from another vet. And at the same time, veganism varies a lot depending on how it is approached and promoted. It can be intended as a lifestyle. It can be intended as a diet, a choice, a politics, or an aspiration. And this last term is the one I want to put the stress on, but I will return to it later. And this is the first point. Secondly, the limitation that the context imposes on us shouldn't serve as justifications for accepting injustices or for accepting violence or for accepting exploitation. In this case, I also include the consumption of animals' bodies. But I think should rather be the starting point to understand the impossibility of being and of remaining totally innocent, especially in the system in which we live. So once again, if we stress this common point, the impossibility of being innocent, right, which doesn't mean the fact that we are all killers, right, but that there are things that we cannot control. And so death of animals will always happen somewhere and for different reasons, and we cannot control that. And we could be responsible indirectly, of course, of the killing of some animals, for example, for a series of reasons that we don't have time to discuss here. But if we start from this idea, which also include the idea of being vulnerable, of being also fallible, of not having the truth in your hand or in your pocket, then I think a dialogue is possible. Starting from one's own experience, one's own difficulties, and try to communicate this without being rude or without being too confrontational. There's no need of this because otherwise dialogue interrupts. Cognitive dissonance, which is something that occurs very much among meat eaters, for example, cannot be resolved with demonstrations, with impositions. It should be, first of all, felt by the person that experienced this. And so I think sharing experiences could be much more useful than trying to impose your views or demonstrate the right, or what for example, is called moral superiority, which actually is a stereotype. I recognize that there are vegans that rely on this idea that they are moral superior because they do this and they do that. I totally disagree with this. I think it's very problematic. And on the other hand, it also reinforced the opposite position. So it's very counterintuitive probably, but it's very problematic for the vegan cause, right? If you want to generalize a little bit. Let's try to consider veganism, and so the practice of veganism, the possible ways of approaching veganism as an aspiration. And this is again some suggestion coming from the tradition of feminism and especially ecofeminism, veganism. aspirational veganism means that we stress the doing rather than the being, rather than the identities. So vegans are those that don't eat animals, not that they are vegans because they were born vegans or because they are better than other people. Try to avoid essentializing position, identities, and even categories, included profession, for example. And also try to not to resort to moral extensionism, so the discourse of rights, because the discourse of rights, once again, believes that we are superior to other beings and we can extend our rights to them. I think this is still a hierarchical position. So insist on complexity, insist on limitation, talk about failure, and talk about attempts and attention toward a possibility that probably is never fully realized, but that you have to tend to. This idea of perfectibility, continuous perfectibility, rather than perfection. And clearly, if you don't buy a chicken in a tray at a supermarket, this will certainly not save the life of that chicken, because that chicken has already been killed. But probably it may indirectly trigger a change in the system of production and consumption, provided that it doesn't remain an individual idea, but it circulates among a collectivity and it becomes something that is discussed among different positions.
Thank you, Federica. So Christian, then from a moral philosophy standpoint, right? What makes such communication constructive rather than confrontational?
Well, I think there are two. So you can look it from either perspective, right? So as Fredrika now articulated a lot of ideas of how you, from a vegan perspective, can sort of be perceived, but also how you can choose to approach discussing with others, right? And I think a similar thing is true also from the veterinarian perspective, as you mentioned with this this example from 2000, what was it, 22? This debate, so that you can, and I think a very basic thing you can ask yourself. So if you take sort of medical ethics on the human side, so a very basic building block for the professional ethics there is that you ask yourself this question: who am I for? So what is the good I'm supposed to be doing in my profession? If there's no answer to that, I have no reason to be a doctor, right? We have no reason to have healthcare. So you have to have some idea of what the good is that you're supposed to do. And the closest that we come, and then we have this more complicated situation for the veterinarian due to the way that societies are organized and farming is sort of institutionalized and so on, and culture. But you also have on the human side this fact. So one of the examples that's often discussed in medical ethics and sort of is a very important sort of point is that when you have a conflict in pediatrics, that is when you treat a child, and you have a conflict between the doctor's perception of what is best for the child and what the parents want, then you go with the child and not with the parents. That's and that's very established, right? That if you have such a conflict and you can't resolve it, at the end of the day, the good I'm supposed to do is about treating the child, not making the parents happy. That's not what the medical doctor is doing. So that's one way of looking at professional ethics, that you kind of act in a particular domain, and that the demands of different kinds of stakeholders that can appear in your practice does not belong in that domain, really. It's not your thing to make other people happy. So you can also have the children of an old patient wanting all kinds of things. Maybe they're interested in getting the inheritance or something like that. And you don't care about that. You care about the health of your patients, basically. So you can transfer that back, that kind of way of thinking about the professional ethics of a health professional, and thinking that, okay, so as a veterinarian now, what am I for? What is the good I'm supposed to be doing? Is it to make the clients happy, or to do things that are sort of attend to the health of the animals? So I think that's a very basic, and this debater that you described, Fredrika, this is clearly someone who has asked herself this question and come up with a particular answer. But I think the starting point is to ask the question: what am I for? What good am I supposed to do? Why am I supposed to do this? In this way, you're sort of doing your own philosophy a little bit. And when you do that, you discover that there are these tension points and this conflict situation where you have to make a choice and a priority. And that's what defines your position, how you stand yourself. So I think that is something that you could really ask yourself. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to interact with a lot of people active in the veterinary medicine in a conference, and also then reviewed a little bit the sort of the ethical codes of veterinarians. Which are interesting to me because they are, in a way, very similar to the ethical codes of doctors in human medicine, but they also dissimilar because so you have the same. You talk about the health of the animals, and you talk about this also from a population health standpoint. So you also address the institutional and the sort of the collective and political side of things, but it's kind of silent about the client and how you should relate to the client. While in human medical professional ethics, you find in the codexes and rule books and so on, you find a lot of things of how you should deal with the facts that there are these other people that make demands on you and that sometimes you're economically dependent on, and all of these kinds of things. And there's a lot of rule having to do with drawing sort of the borderline to these other interests. So this is the professional ethics way of looking at it, when you sort of define your professional domain and the ethos that's supposed to govern that domain. So that in itself will not address the sort of overarching, more political or cultural things, but it will get you started in sort of grounding yourself somewhere, that at least this is one thing I've defined as the important thing to strive for. And then you can ask yourself when you talk to other people, okay, so from that standpoint, what other people tell me about what they think about the practices where I am involved, how does that fit with my standpoint from that point of view? And then, as Fredrika says, some veterinarians then proceed into a more institutionalized and politically articulated idea, which says, for instance, that condemns, for instance, the whole system of industrialized animal farming that we actually have, for instance. So you have veterinarians that end up there. You can also end up in less radical positions, of course, where you want to sort of make things better within the system or something like that. But in order for that space to open up for you as a veterinarian, you have to ask yourself these basic questions. What am I for? What is the good I'm supposed to be doing? Am I doing it? So who am I serving? So that is kind of very basic questions to ask yourself to get yourself going. And then you can ask yourself, okay, so and am I happy with the answers to these questions?
If I may,
yeah.
I would add to this question, I love posing questions to myself all the time, and I think that posing questions is very much useful, definitely much more useful than giving answers. And I would add to this chain of questions that you already said, some other questions that also keep the links between the personal and the structural plane visible. and that could probably lead some veterinarians to defend, right? Defend is not the right term, but to give a solid ground to what they want to express and the position that they want to assume. For example, the question, why are some options more viable than others? Why is meat eating so common in Western countries and is considered also a sign of wealth, and even if things are, of course, changing and very, very quickly? Or who profits from this? Again, the client or the patient, for example, as you said, or who is exploited in this and for what reason? And another questions that is very extreme, but I think veterinarians think, even if they don't articulate it, can animals be happy to live for being slaughtered at the end of their life? For example, this is a huge question, I know, and one which is very, very harmful for those that pose it for themselves, and it's very delicate and it's very dramatic at the same time. But we should start posing these questions. And again, if we go back to that debate initiated by the Dalton's article, we see that Dalton says that veganism is a moral obligation. Another veterinarian answers that is oxymoronic, talking about vegan veterinarians, for example. So the two extremes. And in between, there are many other more nuanced positions. So let's start with nuances. Let's start with superimpositions among different perspectives, for example, in order to find maybe a common ground. This common ground is just a practical common ground because, of course, a radical position and a welfarist position will never go along. But they can coexist. And they also can make society evolve. And the veterinarian profession is a profession just like all other professions. Think about a teacher, think about an artist. For example, a teacher and an artist today is not the same teacher, the same artist that was 1 century ago. And this is also valid for those working in health profession. Of course, the profession is younger, and we don't have a plurisecular tradition of veterinarians because it was born more recently. But again, it evolves. And so it is also, it must be able to relate to the differences in society. For example, all the discourses around sustainability, all the discourses around cognitive animal abilities or sentience, for example, in animals, that I don't like, because I would save also a stupid animal and a non-sentient. Save is not even the right word, but I would respect the life of another animal, even if that animal is not sentient like me, even if that animal hasn't the same language that I have. But again, changes occur. And so it is definitely healthy, I would say, the fact that inside the veterinary profession, you start posing this question and you start debating around this.
Christian, would you like to build on that?
Not really, no.
So I would suggest that we look for common ground at this point. And I'm coming back to you, Christian. Where do you see areas of agreement that often get lost in public debate?
I think that comes from asking. You have to ask yourself these sort of basic questions, and then you have to be aware that some other people answer these basic questions in different ways. And also understand, as Fredrika pointed out also, that it's not always that, a publicly announced opinion is not necessarily grounded in something very deep behind it. It could be just that this is what feels right for you, right? So it could be everything in between. That you so to start to have it. So the best way to start having a discussion is not to. I think this is also what Fredrika says from the veganist standpoint, that you start by being generous to other people and inviting and not confrontational. So you're not trying to start a war and win it. you try to start a dialogue and have it, and be and sort of live with the fact that you can't predict where the dialogue ends up. And I think this is one of the basic things. So this can become problematic in certain practical contexts when you have a lot of if you have a practical context, say you have a very aggressive demonstration or something, that's not the situation where you're having this dialogue, right? So what you do basically is also you have to try to create the spaces where the dialogue becomes possible. So where you can approach yourself in this area. And I think that is perhaps often surprisingly difficult to do when you have especially politically charged areas, right? Because at the same time you want to have the dialogue, but at the same time there is a power struggle going on. And the power struggle can sort of get in the way of creating the space for dialogue when you're having that, right? So that's a very familiar conflict, not only in this area, in a lot of areas where you have sort of a basic ethical dialogue that could be had, but there is also a lot of practical positioning and sort of power struggle regarding trying to realize the position of your own camp or whatever. So you'll find that as soon as you get polarization in that sense, then. So the trick is to get this space where you can, at the same time, hold your sort of opinion, as Fredrika said, but also how should you say, live with the fact that maybe you will change opinion when you start to talk to other people. So that's sort of the trick is, and I think that one thing that philosophy brings to the table is a lot of this kind of attitude. The philosophers become rather strange often because we train so much in having very deep disagreements and just continue talking and changing our minds and sort of going back and forth in a way that's very it's very unlike how the day-to-day way of dealing with sort of charged disagreements are, right? People get angry and upset and start to yell at each other and all kinds of things like that. But this kind of space, I think, that makes space for it. And if you go back then again to the sort of the veterinarian situation, it would be, I see two places where you can create that space, I think. So one space has already been described, really. It's the sort of professional, the way the profession organizes itself, maybe academically and also in professional organization. You can create those spaces there and invite people to ask those difficult questions and start the dialogues a little bit. Of course, it will be difficult in the beginning. Maybe some people will get upset, as Fredrika mentioned, right? But that's kind of worth it, and you have to be patient. The other place, I think, is the education. That's where you so you make sort of the ethical discourse around your profession as one of the building blocks of the education that sort of goes through it, because that's the way you deal with it in human medicine. And I think that in human medicine you have much more space of having disagreements of where you should draw the lines and what choices you should do and how you should position yourself to different kinds of practices that you might not be so happy with from the medical ethical standpoint, but where you have to operate, say, practices like war, for instance, are very sort of charged in medical ethical discussion, for instance, right? So, but but I think so have that as kind of a thing that should be part of the education, just as sort of evidently as the other aspects of the education that you have to learn. The facts about, anatomy and pharmaceuticals and whatever other things you need to, and diagnostics and all of that things that you have to learn. You also have to have sort of foster culture in the profession of this sort of more open kind of discussion. Because I think Fredrika is very right that once you open up the discussion, it will turn out that not every veterinarian thinks alike, right? So that you will find rather big, so large distances sometimes between the way how you position yourself. Some you may find some people who just thinks it's all bullshit. This is about having considerations for the animal, but you will always also find people who are positioning themselves far away from that and have approaching more radical positions, and maybe also that influences how their choices in the profession, right, where they choose to work. So you might not want to, if you have the more radical position, you don't feel so relaxed working, for example, in an industrial farming situation. You would choose to practice your profession in another context. For example, caretaker of wildlife would be an example, for instance.
So Federica, where do you see shared spaces of care or understanding between these ethical worlds?
I think that the common ground, is care. Care is something. Care and responsibility is something that can unite those debating around these issues. Medical professions work with care and around care. And health is never only an individual aspect. It has to do with also the environment in which you live, right? And we know that we are porous. We are just interconnected with what surrounds us, and the environment and the COVID pandemic told us that influence our state of mind, our health, and also our social relations. So I think that we should try to listen carefully to what surrounds us, being them humans or non-humans. And also I strongly believe, according to the feminist tradition, that we cannot know a reality unless we take part in it. And that we cannot just observe without participating. And so this once again brings us to the difficult entanglement between reason and feeling, cognition and empathy, the idea of feeling with feeling, feeling the feeling, feeling with, that has to do, and that involves embodiments, and so embodied experiences, but at the same time shouldn't lead to a total burnout or just a total identification with the animal. I mean, I can relate to the non-human animal without becoming a non-human animal, but instead trying to reflect on the position that I occupy and starting from there. And this calls for responsibility or responsibility, as Donna Haraway calls it, meaning we have to be able to pose the right questions and leave room for the others' answers, but at the same time also try to understand what the others' questions could be. And in this case, the animals' questions, what they ask us, what they actually would want if they could have enough room to relate to us in a proper way. And so let's avoid abstraction once again, and let's try to take into account the context and the care work that involves us, which also entails a moment of self-reflection. And let's try to transform care into a tool of analysis, which once again is what the feminist tradition teaches us. John Tronto, for example, that talks about care as a tool of analysis and politicizes epistemology, substantiated with standpoints. So this using care as a tool of analysis on the one hand makes us aware of the way the others also care for us. It's not only us that care for the others, and at the same time also gives legitimacy to the fact that points of view intervene in the transformation of reality. So not only analyzing what is represented, but also what is not represented and what could actually be or become. On a more mundane level, I would like to suggest a book that I found extremely useful for finding practical tips to navigate the contradictions of wannabe vegan or of a vegan inside an environment that appears as an hostile one, or at least one that doesn't enough welcome your radical positions. And this book is by Carol Adams. Carol Adams is a renowned anti-speciesist thinker. As I explained in my lecture, my first lecture in this learning unit, she wrote The Sexual Politics of Meat, and she's renowned for that book especially. But she also wrote another very useful and more, I would say, lighter book that is called Living Among Meat Eaters. And that gives you tips on how to relate to usual objections, or also how to choose silence, for example, when you feel too attacked, or you feel that you cannot demonstrate what you actually are feeling, and you want to give value to your feeling. So protect yourself, but at the same time acting with care towards those that have different opinions. And the notion of care is a very common ground for many different actions, I think, in our society and professions.
I totally agree with that. So this is also a strong sort of tradition in moral philosophy already from the 1700s at least. So relating a little bit to virtue ethics, as I mentioned, but also asking this question that what is the ground for my moral attitudes and where are they directed? And when you ask that question, you're basically asking yourself, what am I caring for and what should I be caring for? So that's kind of when you start to ask that question. And then you can go further, as Fredrika related, and ask that, okay, so what kind of networks, if you want, or relationships of caring am I a part of? So most of us are sort of a part of social relationships, of course, where people care for each other. But lots of people are already part of relationship webs where it's not only human beings caring for each other, it's also, for example, if you have animals in your midst, you probably have social relationships of care to those too, and they have these relationships back, right? So already there, this observation that the moral universe is a bit larger than what you might think. And it was already larger. You didn't have to invent a new idea. You can discover it just by reflection in that way. So, and that's been a very common tool actually in applied moral philosophy and in feminism as mentioned, but also in environmental ethics. So to do that thing and then you can start to ask yourself the more difficult question is, of course, that is there a limit to what I should care about? So are there certain things I shouldn't be caring about, and and so on and so forth. But that's kind of the next step, right? And then your answer might be the radical thing that, no, there's no limit. While others might say that I want to have a borderline here, and then you try to justify that, right? So
I mean, limits occur even if you don't pose them.
yes,
right?
so there are two things. So you will always be limited because you're just a human being, right? So in that sense, but also when you try to question yourself from a moral standpoint, then when you're maybe demanding more of yourself, so then you can also ask this question and come up with the fact that maybe you would like to be limitless, but you're unable to. But it could also be that you want to have. You find reason to have certain limits or not. So, but that's kind of down the line, I think. So when you start from the veterinarian standpoint, I think those questions are not at the forefront really, because the kind of animals you deal with, non-human animals you deal with as a veterinarian, you will very quickly discover have something about them that grounds this feeling of care, as you say, right? So, and this is very similar to the question I posed in a different way before, when you ask yourself, what am I good for? What is the good I'm supposed to be doing as a veterinarian? It's very similar kind of way of starting a moral reflection, basically. And so, yeah. So, and I totally agree that could be a starting point. And one way, for veterinarians particularly, you can of course talk to people that are sort of engaged in sort of animal issues. But I think another thing for veterinarians that you could actually do is to compare yourself a little bit to medical doctors on the human side, and how they relate to these people, these forces who have power over their patients, where the sort of the standard notion of medical ethics that you should always focus on what's good for your patient and not about these others. Although you have to be practical sometimes and adapt, but that's another matter.
So, Federica, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to say that of course, we cannot do anything, but definitely we can do something. And try not to abstract once again and start from where you are. That could be a very useful suggestion, I think, for those approaching all these issues and also contradictions.
So I believe we now established that veterinarians often face conflicting expectations, right? As animal advocates, as professionals, and I think also as service providers. Federica, how do you interpret these overlapping roles from a societal point of view? If you can add to that, please.
It's not an easy question to answer, but I would stress once again the fact that since societies change, roles, functions, responsibilities also change. And the veterinarian profession can and must change, I think, accordingly. And at the same time, we should always also keep in mind the fact that a veterinarian lives in a context, which is the working environment, but also any other kind of relations that I was saying that any veterinarian should also relate to the environment that is not only the working environment in which he, she, or they live, and the different stakeholders that are involved in this environment. But at the same time, at least this is the way I like to live. I like taking a position, taking a stand in the environment in which I live, because yes, relations are very important, but they are not determining what I do. They are constraints, rather, just like Christian said before, right? And so we have to take into account these constraints but also what comes from other environments. And I think that the veterinarians now cannot ignore, for example, the One Health approach that they also very much debate and know and subscribe, in which we talk about sustainability, resource management, animal welfare, as probably the essential driver of sustainability, and then we have to intend what we intend for welfare and so on and so forth. But trying to be contextual and at the same time holistic in our approach, try to consider that well-being is always systemic, and that if we exploit a huge amount of living beings like we do in factory farms, we are definitely creating an imbalance in this ecosystemic well-being. And these are facts, believe it or not. And so they are demonstrated in many scientific articles. And there's this Science article of 2018 by Poor and Nemesek that was a huge empirical analysis of the result and the impact of factory farms compared to the impact of vegetable proteins, for example. And what they said is that the impacts of the lowest impact animal products exceed average impacts of substitute vegetal proteins across a series of variables like emissions, eutrophication, acidification, and so on and so forth. So there are facts that can be used to sustain your position. But once again, I mean, these facts cannot be enough to, understand what your role is, because there's always this, this area that belongs to you personally, which is the ethical one, and also the political position that you decide to adopt and to embrace, to defend your idea and your rationales, which is definitely as important as the facts and the informations.
So, Christian, how can ethical reasoning help clarify, or maybe to put it better, balance, right, those competing responsibilities?
So I think that as an individual, you can, of course, think about these things and, as you say, try to parse. But I think the most important thing here is not what you do as an individual, but what you do collectively. So as a profession. And I think that, and I think you can here probably, I think the veterinary profession could evolve its way of organizing and acting as a professional collective in a way. Because it's maybe has been a little bit more just reactive to this context rather than trying to shape the context, right? And I think that, as I said, I think again you can learn probably a little bit here from the way that the medical profession on the human side has sort of use this kind of way of organizing themselves in a way. And you can do it also maybe timing it in a way. So one example, a sort of a big change in Europe that's going on comes from EU directive on the use of pharmaceuticals in veterinary medicine, for instance, that came in 2019. As all European Union directive, it takes like at least 10 years to rule it out in practice. But there's a lot of pressure there to not to stop animal farming, but to reorganize it in a way that would require much more attention to the welfare of the animals and the way they live, actually. So some aspects of this industrial atrocities that go on in animal farming would have to be sort of at least limited compared to now, if you go by this directive. Now, so then comes the question, okay, so how should the veterinary profession relate itself to this process of change? Well, you can relate to it, then you have a big decision. Should you try to limit it, or should you try to enforce it? Right? So that's a sort of almost like an existential choice. When you have this sort of involvement in society that clearly shifting the goalposts, and it's pretty radical shift when you look at Europe as a whole and the farming practices going on in Europe as a whole. You have to make this choice, and the choice then could be that you say that, okay, so in this push, we're actually supporting it because we're taking more sides with the animals than the industrial economic interests here, who are maybe at least initially resisting these moves, right? So, but that's kind of a positioning that is that you can only do as an organized collective. And in order to do it as an organized collective, you have to sort of organize yourself as a collective and have the internal discussion as a collective to arrive at that kind of point. So I think that a lot of ways where you try to maneuver your complexity. If you think as a single veterinarian, you come out of veterinary school and you're young and you're starting your profession, I think the natural way to think about it is you should ask yourself those questions we talked about before, and think about your caring sort of mission and so on. But next question to ask, okay, so what can I do? Which is a very practical question, right? And I think what you can do, the best thing you can do, is to engage yourself in these collective activities, to organize yourself together with other people and other veterinarians in this case, then to strengthen the professional collective and its sort of, and maybe develop further its ethoses and sort of positionings. Because by doing that, you also become stronger in this complex that we talked about, the complex context, and in relation to the other stakeholders, powerful stakeholders that you have to relate to. And I think that's so the answer there is that as a veterinarian, act on a organizational, institutional, collective level within your profession.
I totally agree with this idea of associating, which in fact is something I was thinking about. For example, as sociologists, we have an international association of vegan sociologists. We are not there so many, but we are enough in order to organize conferences and speak up and intervene in debates and so on and so forth. So not being alone in this change or attempt to change the status quo is paramount, I think. Also because it gives you strength, it gives you also the idea that you are not so different, so it reinforces the commonalities already existing. And I would also say, as I said before, you cannot do anything, but you can do something. So try to avoid universalizing, try to avoid abstracting from concrete and contextual realities. And also try to avoid simplifying, because I think that complexity is also the way to avoid using, for example, stereotypes that are very often mobilized in this kind of debates. The Nazi vegan, or the ascetic vegan, or the phobic vegan, or again, the saint vegan, right? These are very, very common stereotypes. On the other hand, there are other stereotypes that, of course, can be mobilized. And so these are contradictions, and these contradictions must be addressed. And navigated. We cannot simplify because it's not fruitful in the long term. I think simplifying always invisibilizes differences in favor of identities, and identities polarize debates and create contrasts that, according to me, are not fruitful for the future of our common well-being, okay, of humans and non-humans. So I would also use a very effective, I think, statement by Donna Haraway when she says, try to stay with the trouble. Being a vegan among veterinarians, or try to talk about veganism among veterinarians, is a trouble, because the actual reality goes in the other direction. But since this trouble actually appeared, a fracture, a cleavage, something that can be probably that can give way to a path, a new direction can occur. And so do things step by step. And at the same time, another thing I want to say is don't think that veganism is all or nothing. It's always something that, as I said before, aspirational. So it's a path, it's a process, but it's also something that can be done as far as possible and practicable. It cannot be imposed or enforced. It must be embraced and believed. And so this takes time. And this time is the time of dialogue and also of differences respectfully confronting each other.
Thank you, Federica. And to close our discussion, Christian, if you could offer one piece of advice to our young veterinarians or to our students entering this ethically complex space, what would it be?
So I think it connects to what I said to the last question. So I think one advice is to open up these questions within your professional community. Talk to your professional peers. Become a member of the societies or the professional organization and try to discuss these things. And ask yourself the simplest questions, I think. So there's like one further thing I think you could do also, and that also to sort of to pose the question about what should I do with my professional expertise, right? So put yourself in the role seriously, as now I am this professional. What am I supposed to do with that? And I think there can be many answers to that question. So for some people the answer will be, I will try to make as much money as I can. For other people it will be something very different. But I think only, again, just asking yourself, so you had this education, you have something made you pursue this education, something made you going into this sort of route of life. And then ask yourself, okay, so what am I supposed to do with this then? So you have the sort of collective level engagement, you have the basic ethical questions to ask yourselves and talk to other people about. But then also this question, so okay, so now I have this professional role. Where should I direct it? So, and this is more about the choice of where will I try to operate. I understand, of course, that there are realities that constrain the decisions here, so the work market and so on. But I think just by asking yourself that question, so that you're not only you're not just fall into one place automatically without any kind of reflection, and then you find yourself 20 years down the line asking yourself, well, okay, so was this really what it was all about, right? So you take this kind of idea seriously, and I think this is something, not especially for veterinarians, it's something that goes through, I think, all sort of more advanced professions, that having an advanced professional expertise puts you in a special position of responsibility to ask yourself, what am I supposed to do with this expertise? And just asking yourself that question can and talk to it with your friends and fellow students and you know, things like that, can sort of clarify things. And I think these three things go together. There you have a little bit of identity positioning in a way, but I think that identity will already be there because you have educated yourself to be a veterinarian, so you can just as well ask yourself, what am I supposed to do to do with the fact that I am a veterinarian, right? So there are certain special things I can contribute here. So that's kind of the three things I would say that you can develop yourself. And then of course you can end up just saying, well, all these things you talked about, I don't think I care so much about that. I will just do something simple with my life. You can also end up in a completely different place.
Thank you, Christian. And lastly, Federica, what would your message be to my colleagues? Especially if I can, especially regarding how to stay open and compassionate, right? Amid these challenges.
Yeah, I think, first of all, pose questions to yourself rather than to others. I already said what to avoid, right? And now what to do is very, very simple. First, pose these questions to yourself and see where you start from and where you're leading to. So the main question that, according to me, one in the position of wannabe vegan veterinarian or vegan veterinarian should be, am I at peace with what I know and what I do? How do I feel? So trying always to keep the plane of the doing and the knowing and the feeling together, because these are the orientations, at least according to me, that allows you to take a stand in society or not. Probably you want to avoid taking a stand, but I think this is honest, and it's an honest way to be in society, posing questions to yourself first.
Thank you both. Thank you, Federica, and thank you, Christian, for sharing your reflections and perspectives today. And I guess we can wrap up with this. It was the most interesting conversation that I had in a while. Thank you very much. Thank you very much both. Thank you very much both. This conversation reminds us that ethical thinking is not about finding a single answer, but about learning how to keep the dialogue open between professions, philosophies, and lived experience. I hope this discussion helps our listeners, especially veterinary students and colleagues, reflect on how values, emotions, and communication shape our daily professional choices. This podcast is part of the EUTOPIA Learning Community, Veganism versus Animal Protein Consumption, developed within the EUTOPIA European University Alliance. You can learn more about the Alliance and its activities by visiting eutopia-university.eu. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to join us again in the next episode as we continue exploring how animals, humans, and society are connecting through care, responsibility, and ethics.